There's a photograph from Stalingrad in late 1942 that shows a German soldier standing in what was once a street. Behind him, buildings rise like broken teeth against a grey sky. Walls without roofs, windows without glass doorways that open onto nothing. The street itself is buried under rubble, and the soldier is looking at something out of frame, his face expressing what might be confusion or exhaustion or dawning horror. What the photograph doesn't show is that by the time it was taken, that soldier was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. The city had already claimed him. Stalingrad wasn't conquered or defended in any conventional sense. It consumed. It devoured. It became a mouth that opened wide and swallowed an entire German army, 300,000 men, who walked into a trap made of rubble and ruins and kept walking deeper until there was no way out. This is the story of how a city became a predator and how the most powerful army in Europe became its prey. August 23rd, 1942. The German 6th Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. They had travelled over 1,000 miles from Germany across Poland through Ukraine deep into the Soviet Union. They had crushed Soviet armies, captured millions of prisoners, seized territory larger than France. They were veterans of blitzkrieg, masters of mobile warfare, confident in their superiority. Stalingrad was just another city in their path, another objective to be taken. Intelligence reports suggested the city's defences were crumbling, that Soviet morale was broken, that one more push would secure the Volga River and open the route to the Caucasus oil fields that Germany desperately needed. The 6th Army expected to take Stalingrad in a few days, maybe a week. They would be wrong in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River for over 20 miles, a thin industrial ribbon clinging to the riverbank. Factories dominated the northern districts: the Red October steel plant, the Barricadi gun factory, the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory that had been converted to produce tanks. In the centre, apartment blocks and government buildings rose in the Soviet style, functional grey packed close together. To the south, worker housing and smaller industrial facilities. It was a city built for production, not beauty. A city of smokestacks and concrete, of industrial efficiency and Soviet ambition. Before the war, nearly 500,000 people had lived there. By August 1942, most of them were gone evacuated or fled, leaving behind a city that was more machine than home. And that machine was about to break down in the most catastrophic way possible. The Luftwaffe arrived first. On August 23rd, German bombers appeared over Stalingrad in waves, hundreds of aircraft dropping thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries. The bombing lasted all day and into the night. Entire neighbourhoods vanished into fireballs. Oil storage tanks exploded, sending burning petroleum flowing through the streets like rivers of fire. Wooden buildings ignited, and the flames spread, merged, created a firestorm that generated its own weather winds, strong enough to lift debris hundreds of feet into the air, temperatures hot enough to melt metal. 40,000 civilians died in that first day of bombing, most of them incinerated or crushed or suffocated in basements where they'd sought shelter. The bombing was supposed to break Soviet resistance to make the city easy to capture. Instead, it created something else entirely. It created the maze. The rubble wasn't random. Buildings didn't just collapse, they fragmented into defensive positions. A factory wall blown open became a firing position overlooking 3 streets. An apartment block broken in half created elevated positions on each floor with clear sightlines and protection from direct fire. Basements became bunkers. Sewers became tunnels. The Volga River, which had been a transportation route, became the only lifeline into the city, a narrow water corridor under constant German artillery fire that Soviet forces used to ferry reinforcements and supplies across at night. The bombing had turned Stalingrad into exactly the kind of terrain that negated every German advantage. Tanks couldn't maneuver through rubble fields. Artillery couldn't target enemies hiding in basements. Air superiority meant nothing when the fighting happened inside buildings, room to room, floor to floor. The Germans had spent one day bombing the city, and had inadvertently created a fortress specifically designed to kill them. German ground forces entered Stalingrad in early September, and immediately the nature of warfare changed. Everything they had trained for, everything that had worked in Poland and France, and across the Soviet plains stopped working. Blitzkrieg required mobility, rapid advances, flanking maneuvers, breakthrough, and exploitation. Stalingrad had no flanks. It was a linear battlefield, a narrow strip between the Volga and the approach roads, and the only direction to move was forward into the rubble, into the ruins, into the meat grinder. The Germans advanced building by building, sometimes room by room. They would take a factory in the morning and lose it by evening. They would capture an apartment block and find Soviet soldiers still fighting from the basement 3 days later. Distance lost all meaning. A soldier could spend a week fighting to advance for 50 meters. 50 meters through hell. The city imposed its own logic. In open warfare, the Germans had every advantage. Better training, better tactics, better equipment. In Stalingrad, none of that mattered. The fighting was too close for tactics, too chaotic for training to matter. A veteran panzer commander was no more effective than a teenage conscript when both were crawling through rubble trying not to be shot. The weapons that had dominated battlefields became useless. Tanks, the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, became targets, slow, vulnerable, unable to elevate their guns high enough to hit enemies on upper floors. German forces learned to avoid bringing tanks into the city centre because Soviet anti-tank teams would destroy them within minutes. Artillery, which had provided overwhelming fire support in open terrain, was ineffective in urban fighting where friend and foe were separated by walls, not distance. Even the Luftwaffe, which had ruled the skies since the war, found its power diminished. Bombing runs couldn't distinguish between German and Soviet positions when both occupied the same building. The city had neutralized everything that made the Wehrmacht formidable. What replaced conventional warfare was something primitive and terrible. Fighting in Stalingrad was murder, not combat. Soldiers fought with rifles and machine guns at distances of 5 meters. They fought with grenades, throwing them through doorways and into rooms they couldn't see. They fought with knives and entrenching tools, and sometimes their bare hands. They fought in darkness, in basements without light, in ruins where the sun was blocked by debris and smoke so thick you couldn't see 3 feet in front of you. The city was constantly burning. Fires started by bombing or artillery would smoulder for days, filling the air with smoke and ash. Soldiers breathed dust and smoke, and the smell of death, which was everywhere, inescapable. Bodies couldn't be recovered. There was nowhere to take them, no time to deal with them. They lay where they fell in streets and stairwells and cellars until they rotted or were buried by more rubble. The city wasn't just killing soldiers. It was destroying their humanity, reducing them to animals fighting for survival. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat warfare. Soldiers scurrying through sewers and basements, fighting in the dark, killing by sound and instinct. But the metaphor was wrong. Rats are survivors, adaptable and clever. The Germans in Stalingrad weren't surviving. They were dying by hundreds every day. And every day they pushed deeper into the city, committed more troops, invested more resources into taking objectives that became meaningless as soon as they were captured. There's a psychological phenomenon in gambling where players who are losing will double down, bet more risk, more because they've already invested so much they can't imagine walking away. The Germans fell into the same trap. They had lost thousands of men taking the suburbs. They couldn't abandon those gains, so they pushed into the factory district. They lost thousands more taking the factories. They couldn't abandon those gains either, so they pushed toward the Volga riverbank. Each advance required another advance to justify the previous one. Each victory demanded another victory. The city had become a gambler's fallacy made concrete, and the Germans couldn't stop betting. Soviet strategy understood this. General Vasily Chwikov, commanding the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, didn't try to hold ground in the conventional sense. He didn't establish defensive lines or fall back in good order. Instead, he kept his forces close to the Germans, so close that German artillery and air support couldn't be used without hitting their own troops. He called it hugging the enemy. Soviet soldiers would retreat from one floor of a building and immediately counterattack from another. They would surrender a factory's main floor and continue fighting from the basement. They would lose 90% of a city block and defend the remaining 10% with fanatical determination, not because that 10% was strategically important, but because keeping the Germans fighting, keeping them engaged, keeping them dying was the entire strategy. The goal wasn't to win. The goal was to make the Germans lose, slowly, painfully, expensively, to make them bleed until they ran out of blood. The city provided infinite defensive positions. Every pile of rubble was cover. Every broken wall created a kill zone. Every basement was a fortress that had to be cleared with grenades and gunfire. Soviet forces became expert at urban combat because they had no choice. There was nowhere to retreat to. The Volga River was at their backs, and crossing it under fire was nearly impossible. So they stayed and fought, and the city taught them how to kill. They learned to move at night, to strike from unexpected directions, to disappear into ruins before the Germans could respond. They learned that the third floor of a bombed building was safer than the first, because German soldiers, exhausted and cautious, rarely cleared upper floors thoroughly. They learned that German soldiers would avoid basements after dark, because basements were death traps close quarters, where a single Soviet soldier with a submachine gun could kill an entire German squad. They learned that time was their weapon. Every hour the Germans spent in Stalingrad was an hour their supply lines were stretched thinner, their reinforcements were depleted, their will to fight eroded. And the Germans learned too late that capturing Stalingrad was impossible because there was nothing to capture. A city is defined by its function: government buildings, commercial districts, residential areas. Stalingrad had none of that anymore. It was rubble. It was ruins. It was a graveyard pretending to be a battlefield. The Germans would take a factory and declare victory, but the factory was just walls and machinery. It had no value, no purpose, no significance, beyond the propaganda claim that it had been captured. They would seize an apartment block and hoist a flag, but the flag flew over nothing. The building was destroyed, uninhabitable, useless. They were fighting for symbols, for names on maps, for objectives that existed only in operation orders and commanders' minds. The city itself didn't care who held what. It just kept killing. By October 1942, the German Sixth Army had pushed the Soviets into a narrow strip of land along the Volga, in some places only a few hundred meters wide. On maps, it looked like victory was imminent. One more push, and the Soviets would be driven into the river. But maps lie. The fighting was more intense than ever because the smaller the territory, the more concentrated the defenses. Soviet forces dug into every building, every cellar, every pile of debris. German soldiers were dying to advance 10 meters. Units that had started the battle at full strength were down to 20% effectiveness. Companies that should have had 150 men were operating with 30. Battalions that should have had 800 men were operating with 200. The Sixth Army was being bled white, and still the order came down from higher command: take Stalingrad, clear the city, reach the Volga. The orders came from men hundreds of miles away, men who read reports and looked at maps and saw a city that was 90% captured, who couldn't understand why the last 10% was taking so long. They couldn't understand because they weren't there. They hadn't seen what Stalingrad had become. November 19th, 1942. Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive counter-offensive that struck not at Stalingrad, but at the flanks of the German advance, at the positions held by Romanian and Italian armies that were less well-equipped and less motivated than German units. The Soviet pincer movements broke through within days, encircling the entire German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. 300,000 German soldiers, along with supporting units, were trapped in the city they had been trying to capture. The trap closed, the mouth shut, and the city that had been killing them for months now held them captive to kill them more slowly. The irony is perfect and terrible. The Germans had wanted Stalingrad. They had committed an entire army to taking it. They had sacrificed tens of thousands of lives to capture its ruins. Now they had it, and it was their prison. The city they had destroyed with their own bombing, the rubble they had created, the maze they had built, it all became the walls of their cage. They were trapped inside a graveyard of their own making, surrounded by enemies, cut off from supplies with winter approaching and no hope of relief. Hitler ordered them to hold their position to create a fortress Stalingrad and wait for relief forces to break through. But there were no relief forces capable of breaking through. The German army didn't have the strength, didn't have the logistics, didn't have the capability. The Sixth Army was abandoned, left to die, and Stalingrad, patient and implacable, began to finish the job it had started in August. Winter arrived. Temperatures dropped to 20, 30, 40 below zero. German soldiers had no winter clothing because the Wehrmacht had expected to win the war before winter came. They had summer uniforms, inadequate coats, boots that fell apart in the cold. Frostbite became as deadly as Soviet bullets. Soldiers would lose fingers, toes, entire limbs to the cold. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Food supplies dwindled. The Luftwaffe attempted to supply the trapped army by air, but couldn't deliver even half of what was needed. Soldiers were on starvation rations, sometimes eating sawdust mixed with grain, sometimes eating their horses, sometimes eating nothing. Disease spread: typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. Men died in their sleep from cold and hunger. They died of infected wounds because there were no medical supplies. They died of despair, simply giving up, lying down in the rubble and not getting up. The city had stopped needing to fight them. It just waited for them to die. Soviet forces tightened the noose. They didn't need to launch massive assaults the Germans were too weak to resist. They simply compressed the pocket day by day, pushing the Germans into smaller areas, capturing the makeshift airfields, destroying supply depots, killing the trapped soldiers by hundreds and thousands. By January 1943, the southern pocket of the encirclement had surrendered. The northern pocket held on, but barely. Paulus, the general who had led the Sixth Army into Stalingrad, was promoted to Field Marshal on January 30th, a cynical move by Hitler, because no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: fight to the death or kill yourself. Paulus did neither. On February 2nd, 1943, the last German forces in Stalingrad surrendered. Of the 300,000 men encircled, only 90,000 were still alive to become prisoners. Of those 90,000, only 6,000 would survive Soviet captivity to return to Germany years later. The rest died in POW camps, succumbing to the same cold and hunger and disease that had killed their comrades in the city. Stalingrad had consumed an entire army, not defeated it in battle, consumed it, swallowed it whole and digested it slowly. The city became a tomb, a monument built from corpses and rubble. It stands in military history as a unique catastrophe, not because one side won and the other lost, but because the battlefield itself became the weapon. The Germans had every advantage when they arrived at Stalingrad. They were better trained, better equipped, more experienced. They should have won. In any conventional battle, in any open field engagement, they would have won. But Stalingrad wasn't a conventional battle. It was something else. It was urban warfare at its most primitive and brutal. It was attrition warfare, where both sides bled, but one side had more blood to give. It was a psychological trap where sunk costs and German pride and Hitler's obstinacy combined to prevent retreat until retreat became impossible. The lesson of Stalingrad isn't about Soviet resilience or German failure, or the genius of any particular commander. The lesson is that cities are dangerous, not because they're well defended or strategically important, but because they're chaotic. They're three-dimensional battlefields, where height matters as much as distance, where civilians and soldiers mix together, where the distinction between front line and rear area disappears. They're environments that negate the advantages of mobility, firepower, and air superiority. They're meat grinders that consume armies regardless of quality or motivation. Urban warfare is the worst kind of warfare, the slowest, the bloodiest, the most destructive. Stalingrad proved that. And yet cities continue to become battlefields. Aleppo, Mosul, Mariupol, and armies continue to learn the same lesson that the German Sixth Army learned in 1942, that capturing a city is easy, but holding it is impossible, and the city itself will kill you if you stay too long. The ruins of Stalingrad smouldered for months after the battle ended. The city had been so thoroughly destroyed that reconstruction took decades. The Soviet Union rebuilt it as Volgograd, erasing the name Stalin, but keeping the memory of the battle. Monuments were erected: the towering Mother Russia statue, the museum at Mamayev Kurgan, the panorama of the battle. These monuments commemorate Soviet victory, Soviet sacrifice, Soviet triumph over fascism. But they miss something essential. They portray the battle as a contest between armies, between ideologies, between Hitler and Stalin. That's not what Stalingrad was. Stalingrad was a place that became a trap, a city that became a predator, a battlefield that consumed everyone who entered it, regardless of nationality or ideology. The Soviets won, yes, but at a cost that almost matched the German losses. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were killed or wounded in the fighting around Stalingrad. The city killed them too. It just killed the Germans more. There's a moment in every Stalingrad battle account where German soldiers realize they're trapped. It's not when the encirclement closes. It's earlier. It's sometime in October or November, when they've been fighting for weeks, when they've taken 90% of the city, when victory seems so close they can taste it. And they look around at the ruins, at the endless rubble, at the bodies, and the smoke, and the burning buildings, and they understand, really understand, that this city will never be captured because there's nothing left to capture, that every meter they advance costs lives they can't afford to lose, that the Soviets are fighting differently, using the city as a weapon, hugging close to negate German advantages, that the city itself has become the enemy and it's winning. That's the moment when the trap closes, even if the soldiers don't realize it yet. That's when Stalingrad swallows them. August 23rd to February 2, 5 months, one city, one trapped army, 300,000 men who marched in confident and left in body bags or prisoner columns. Stalingrad didn't win the war. The Soviet Union would fight for 2 more years to reach Berlin, but it broke the myth of German invincibility. It proved that the Wehrmacht could be beaten, that Hitler's armies could be destroyed, that the tide of war could turn. More than that, it demonstrated something fundamental about modern warfare, that technology and training and tactics mean nothing if the terrain itself works against you, that cities are graveyards for conventional armies, that rubble is the perfect defensive position, and there's no way to attack rubble without dying in rubble. The photograph I mentioned at the beginning, the German soldier standing in the ruins, becomes more haunting when you know the context. He's surrounded by his own grave. The rubble around him is the material of his tomb. The city has already claimed him. He's just waiting to die, though he might not know it yet. That's what Stalingrad was. A mass grave that soldiers walked into, voluntarily, one after another, battalion after battalion, division after division, until the grave was full and the city, satisfied, finally closed its mouth. The Battle of Stalingrad wasn't won by the Soviets. It was lost by the Germans, but more accurately, it was consumed by the city itself, which ate an army and left nothing but bones and ruins and warnings that nobody heeded. Cities will always be battlefields. Armies will always enter them, thinking they can win. And the cities will always win in the end, because cities don't care about victory or defeat. They only care about survival. And if survival means consuming everyone who fights inside their borders, then that's what cities will do. Stalingrad proved it. The rubble proved it. The 300,000 corpses proved it. The city that ate an army proved it beyond any doubt. And still we forget. Still armies enter cities expecting to win. Still the meat grinder waits patient and hungry, ready to consume the next foolish army that thinks it can conquer chaos. That's the lesson of Stalingrad. That's the warning written in bones and rubble. That cities are traps, and once you enter, you're already dead. You just don't know it yet.